Okay, part two of Cynicism by Ansgar Allen. Let's do this. Probably not going to be a long one today. I got off of work, very sweaty, very gross. I need to shower, but I just thought, why not read a couple pages? And I guess like um, a little something for the future. I watched this video essay about why Jesse Pinkman is like Jesus, or like his story is like synonymous with like a Jesus like character. And that like kind of inspired me to like maybe pick up a project I kind of like abandoned, writing this script for the like theme of freedom and using the ocean as a way to portray that theme. And I was going to use examples in Attack on Titan and Breaking Bad. And I have the script. Like I wrote a couple pages in my notebook, but I think I scrapped it because I didn't really like the flow, and like it wasn't like as organized as I wanted it to. But I don't know. Now I feel like I've struck some sort of like creative um, nerve, and I think I'd like to give the idea another try. So hopefully, sometime when I have time, because that's just not something I have a lot of. Because I'd like to spend like a whole day, writing, and I'd like to spend a whole, and after that, I'd like to, you know, edit and record and stuff like that. Um, but after work and maybe after class, maybe that's like something I could definitely after work. No, I don't. I just don't have like the energy. But after class, maybe I could start writing it again and revisiting the idea, look it over. Yeah, I think I've already kind of given a lot away in terms of like what I wanted to do with it, but just know that it's like Attack on Titan X Breaking Bad. It's pretty cool. Um, so yeah, let's get on to chapter 2. Dos, doce. Okay, so chapter 2. Here, let's see how long this chapter is, Brett, because I ain't looking to be here all day. Yeah, I'm not gonna read. We'll get to like halfway or something. Let me turn on the fan. Jesus Christ. Okay. All right. So, chapter 2 is reject all disciples, agent cynicism, and the fear of speech. Diogenes remains an elusive figure. The most extensive collection of anecdotes relating to Diogenes can be found in Diogenes Laertes' Live of Eminent Philosophers, compiled during the 3rd century CE, that is 5 centuries after Diogenes, whose life spanned the 4th century BCE. The purpose served by retrospect accounts of Cynic philosophy were many and various. These combined nostalgic attempts to reclaim a lost tradition with open hostility directed at those who were its false inheritors. They include the satires of Lucian in the 2nd century CE and critics of Julian in the 4th. Those historical records that do survive, then, of questionable accuracy, if not outright distortions and falsifications of Cynic philosophy. For these alone, cynicism continues to evade those who would seek to study it. Although these are familiar problems for historical scholarship, the situation is complicated further by the distinctly evasive nature of ancient cynicism. Scholars must also deal with the underprinting hostility of Cynic philosophy to activities that include those of the contemporary researcher. Even if Cynic teachings and had been transmitted in a more direct fashion, and we could be sure about the accuracy of our sources, cynicism would be a disrupted presence. As the next two chapters explore, there is something about ancient cynicism that must defy our understanding. Or to put it more strongly, to the extent that ancient cynicism retains anything of its former vitality, it will be confounded to its interpreters, evading those who would like to understand where it came from, how it functioned, and what it hoped to achieve. Typically, when faced with a reluctant, decidedly evasive object of research, academic evader responds by recommending more of itself, using the reluctance to justify further investigations, piling one question upon another, diversifying the methodologies, inventing discussions and debate, complicating the problem it constructs as it attempts to delve further into thing that resists the oh the very thing that resists the penetrating gaze, the accounting logic of a researcher. Here, the very obscurity and outward hostility that must necessarily shroud ancient cynicism functions as a stimulus for contemporary research, ensuring the deferral of the prospect of a more radically upsetting confrontation with ancient cynicism. The hostility to intellectual culture that is detectable within the Cynic tradition has failed to staunch the activities of the research that takes this practice and associated traditions as its object of interest. In recent years, academic monographs and papers dealing with this area of study have followed one another in quick succession, adding considerable nuance to our understanding of cynicism as a field of study, while characteristically failing to take up the provocation of Cynic philosophy. Without pretending to side with ancient cynicism as if escape from contemporary intellectual culture were that easy, this book calls attention to the tensions. Ooh, this book calls attention to the tensions. Oh, wow, that's nice. One might observe between the culture of education and the radically exposed exploits of Cynic philosophy. Discussions of the educational implications of ancient cynicism are rare, that those and those that do exist are narrowly conceived. Indeed, there is much more straightforward and less challenging interpretation of Cynic educational philosophy than the one offered here. To outline this alternative, it is worth turning to Donald Dudley's influential study of ancient cynicism, which remains a key reference point for much recent scholarship. It offers a brief consideration of what Dudley calls Cynic education theory. For Dudley, an understanding of the educational implications of Cynic philosophy may be acquired by studying the most obvious educational activities of Diogenes. Here, purported role as a household tutor, contained in a brief anecdote from Laertes' lives. Though Dudley argues earlier in his book that the stories of Diogenes captured by pirates and subsequently purchased by Xanades of Corinth is an invention, he nonetheless takes this story to encapsulate Cynic educational philosophy. Dudley presents Diogenes as an ideal pedagogue in this account, which Diogenes is paying close attention in his role as a Xanade slave/teacher to the moral foundation of his pupils. The educational program attributed to Diogenes is, as Dudley interprets it, a compound of various existing systems interpreted in a cynical spirit. Here, ordinary Greek elementary actions, form its backbone, augmented by features derived from the Sparta and from the Persian system. The emphasis in, jeez, the emphasis in this anecdote is on the formation of the self-sufficient individuals who will go about silent and not looking about them in the streets. If Diogenes' involvement in producing quiet, orderly pupils does not seem odd enough, we are told that Diogenes' pupils apparently held him with great regard. The deception of a Cynic education seems decidedly out of kilter. When compared with more scandalous confrontational anecdotes of Diogenes found elsewhere in Laertes' collection, as a compiler of anecdotes, Laertes was content to collect contradictory accounts and place them alongside one another, making no attempts to attribute between them. Given these considerations, it is worth pondering the educational implications of Cynic philosophy more generally rather than pick out, prioritize, and interpret occasional and more direct mentions of education. For example, the anecdotes collected by Laertes, such as an approach, one that leads beyond the story of Diogenes as a household tutor and pursues education itself in broader terms, informs my reading below. Let's see. But I'm tired. In constructing its overview of ancient Cynicism, this book draws from the considerable scholarship that has emerged in the last 3 decades. But most of all, it enjoys the work of two writers, Michael Foucault, with Peter Sloterdijk, who were in each in their own way unusually attentive and repetitive and receptive to the deviant intent of ancient cynicism. Indeed, Peter's 1983 bestseller Critique of Cynical Reason and Michael's last lecture series at the College de France, delivered in 1984, helped stimulate the work referred to as above, as research endeavor that would offered its own subsequent reading significance of Asian cynicism. What? His follow analysis appears at times to privilege Foucault's and Sloterdijk's early account. It is with the purpose of intending more closely to the consequences of cynicism viewed here in a countercultural practice by both Michael and Peter displayed some kind of sympathy for. Dude, I'm literally spaced out so much. I thought it meant, for some reason, I thought it read that you could like send a letter to their house or something. Oh my god. Bro, this might be like the shortest episode of all time. I'm not sure if I'll be able to make it. Okay, let's see. Where do I just need to make it? I just need to make it to 7. I need to make it to 27. Okay. 27 and we're done. Although little of early Cynic writing survives, including nothing by Diogenes, some ancient sources do report titles of works that have been lost to history. These Cynic outputs were said to be rather unconventional, either parodying conventional forms of writing or subverting convention by adopting non-literally forms such as the deliberate Cynic warning. Where it existed was also um, of second significance in the relation to the lived example of the Cynic. If Diogenes did write, and not all ancient sources confirm this, his attitude to writing is suggested by the following anecdote. Uh, Hegesus, who asked Diogenes to lend him one of his writings, Diogenes replied, "You are a simpleton, Hegesias. You do not choose painted figures, but real ones, and yet you pass over the true training that would apply yourself to written rules." Like many other ancient philosophers, Cynic teaching were at the first passed on through an oral tradition and taken up as a way of life. Unlike most other philosophies, a subsequent Cynic school was never established, one that might have codified Cynic principles and establish a canon, or other philosophies were only made available in their advanced form of eclectic groups. Cynicism addressed a broader evidence. Cynics were known for their outward behavior, for how they express themselves in public, rather than for the distinct and clearly stated teachings of philosophy in the more conventional sense. Hmm. Uh, the cynics, the cynic had scant regard for the formal lectures and exalted language of established philosophy. Diogenes did his best to introduce doubt as whether or as to whether he even merited the title philosopher, inventing others to consider him a fraud. Cynicism of this sort is always on point of dismissal as sham philosophy, measuring its success perhaps by the extent to which it remains marginal from the point of view of its more respectable cousin. To adopt a base idiom, yeah, that will define this chapter and the one that follows, the one that might say that the cynic who simply regards such dialogue as hot air passes wind by way of critique. So let's look at status in philosophy. The philosophical status of cynicism is placed within the canon is difficult to establish given that it had no fixed dogmata and seems to have operated without a defined end or philosophical goal, otherwise known as at- atelos. This set is apart from other more rebellious um, teleological philosophies such as Stoicism and Epicuricism. Consequently, some had struggled to include cynicism with the philosophical common, whereas others have admitted cynicism by articulating an intellectual framework on its behalf, associating with fundamental condiments, commodities of freedom. Such mastery happens. Virtue, consumptivism, my God, and nature. A countervailing view suggests that the most famous talents of Cynic philosophy grew out of the continual process um, of ad hoc improvisation. There was no fundamental or pigments. That is the position taken over here. On this reading key, Cynic ideas and methods were maintained. The rebellion. Oh my God. Jesus Christ. Where was I? Someone's name. Um, Rendering it inert as it marginalized the rebellious impulse, the situated crafty playfulness, and the devious impoverishments, improvisation that distinguished it from all other philosophies. Only once these practices had been secured, interpreted by, um, interpreted and codified, could become what they need, the inflexible imprint of Cynic tradition. The construction of Cynic tradition would, in effect, be the death of cynicism. Against Plato's conception of the philosopher as a specter of time and eternity, one might say that Diogenes was the philosopher of contingency, of life in the barrel. When, but even this statement offers too much by the way of definition, as if the telos of Cynic philosophy were a life of that sort. According to the one version of the story, Diogenes of Sinope ended up living on the streets out of necessity. Like he was not native to Athens, but remembered from the border. They just like let him in. What? What am I talking about? my God. According to one version of the story, Diogenes of Sinope and ended up on the street out of necessity. He was not native to Athens, but arrived from the borders of Greek world as an exile, banished from his home city, a wandering migrant who would have uh, made himself increasingly unwelcome in his own community. Diogenes is famous for setting up home in a storage jar, but he did so only because the little house he had hoped for could not be arranged at the time. The barrel in which he would not just live but roll around. Yawn is significantly gains significance later as the site of his more devious cynicisms, unprincipled and doggled, subversive. If Cynic philosophy was improvised and contingent and did not begin with dogma or declaration of what it was valued most, its development and developing form should be understood as a function for some clear canonical statement concerning the nature and the intent of cynicism might then opt for the opposite approach and define Cynic philosophy by the way it is opposed. But here again, cynicism wrongfoots its interpreters. Cynicism was not reactive in any straightforward sense. Cynicism does not simply operate on the fine of somebody's desk. Cynicism was not reactive in any straightforward sense. A cynic does not simply oppose and define cynic philosophy in reaction to what is valued or given esteem. Despite appearances, cynics had nothing against the pursuit of life. For example, cynics held valued green, had valued or given esteem. Despite appearances, cynics and nothing against the pursuit of virtue. For example, which is so hard to say, they had no principal philosophical objections to virtue as such. Their contempt was was heaped on the idea that virtue must be based on canonical principles. It should be. Their contempt was heaped on the idea that virtue must be based on canonical principles and should be cultivated in a rarefied atmosphere. For this, they would famously be accused of attempting a shortcut to virtue, for underwhelming a set privilege assumption that underpin Western philosophy and its education and religious legacies as Serena, Roman statesman, and the tutor to Emperor Nero. 1, 2. Okay, I'm done. That was actually crazy. I have no idea what just happened. I need to take a break here. Yeah, that was such a disaster of a reading session, but whatever. I need a nap and a shower. Okay, I'll be back. Bye bye, everybody.